Good afternoon and welcome. I am Suzanne Stewart-Steinberg, Director of the Pembroke Center, and I am delighted to welcome you all today to our virtual panel, Black Women and the Vote. The Pembroke Center, along with the Pembroke Center Associates Council, is presenting this event, and we are grateful for the co-sponsorship of the Pembroke Club, the Inman Page Black Alumni Council, and the Women's Leadership Council. I want here also to take the opportunity to thank the Pembroke staff for all the work they have done on making this event happen, and especially I would like to call out Martha Hamlin and Juliet Kiley. 2020 is not only a critical election year, but also the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which ensured that the right to vote could not be denied or abridged on account of sex. Today's panel will focus on Black women's political engagement and activism, including efforts to secure and protect voting rights. We are privileged to have three Stellar Brown faculty and also my colleagues joining us here today, Françoise Hamlin, Juliet Hooker, and Emily Owens. Moderating the panel today is Tanya K. Hernandez, the Archibald R. Murray Professor of Law at Fordham University School of Law and an internationally recognized comparative race law expert. Tanya is a Brown graduate, parent of a Brown graduate, and a member of the Pembroke Center Associates Council. She received her JD from Yale Law School and has served as a research fellow or visiting scholar at Princeton, Rutgers, the Fred T. Korematsu Center for Law and Equality, and the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. Her work has been published in numerous law reviews, including those of Cornell, Harvard, NYU, Berkeley, and Yale. And she's also has published in news outlets such as the New York Times, among many others. Tanya is the author of Multiracials and Civil Rights, Mixed Race Stories and Discrimination from NYU Press, and also On Latino Anti-Black Bias, Racial Innocence and the Struggle for Equality, which is forthcoming from Beacon Press. Tanya, thank you so much for being with us today. I really appreciate your help. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here and an honor to help moderate this very distinguished panel. And so what I'd like to do to sort of prime us for our conversation today is to sort of, in this moment that we are now having nationally with hashtag Black Lives Matter, the idea of talking about the vote right upon our national presidential election obviously is very timely. With this first slide, I wanted to just sort of underscore how the ways in which when in the public discourse and the media, there is a mention of the celebration of the 19th Amendment and women's rights and the fight for the women's vote, that this is the typical photo that is demonstrated, right? You know, that of the white women who were at the helm or thought to be at the helm with regards to the struggle for equality. And so, you know, often, you know, there'll be pictures of Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, etc. What isn't typically shown are all the Black women who also were fighting for the right to vote for women and for men of color as well. And the women who are on our panel today are going to help fill those gaps for us with regards to the importance of Black female political activism and the ways in which they paved the way for so many of the rights that we have today. So without further ado, I'd like to begin introducing our panel. So what I will now do is introduce each panelist as they speak, so that way the biography is fresh in your minds right before their presentation. So the first to share with us today will be Professor Emily A. Owens. She is the David and Michelle Ebersman Assistant Professor of History here at Brown University and works on histories of race, gender, and sexuality. Her first book, The Fantasy of Consent, Sex, Affect, Commerce in the 19th Century New Orleans, surfaces the survival strategies of women of color whose lives were bound by sexual labor under slavery, and is forthcoming from the University of North Carolina Press. Her work has appeared in Louisiana History, Feminist Formations, The Black Scholar, Differences, and Signs, Journal of Women, Culture, and Society. In addition to her appointment in history, Professor Owens also acts as a faculty fellow at the Brown Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. Welcome, Professor Owens. Lovely to have you here with us today.
Thank you so much, Professor Hernandez, and thank you to the Pembroke Center and to Professor Stuart Steinberg for having me. I'm delighted to be here and really honored to be in such excellent company with my co-panelists. So I, what we've been kind of talking about this panel and how, the anniversary of the 19th Amendment was on everyone's radar quite a long time ago because it's a big anniversary and it's an important legal milestone for American women. But of course, a lot has changed since we started thinking about this a year ago. And I think a sense of urgency around the stakes of suffrage and the stakes of political participation seem to me extremely important right now and really imminent as the next election draws near and as the impact of the last election is all around us. So I am going to talk briefly about sort of feminist history and about the place of Black women and the vote within that history. I want to begin by talking about feminist history and the phrase that we often use to describe the lead up to the 19th Amendment and the suffragists movement, which is first wave. We often use first wave to talk about the fight that American and British women undertook to gain the right to vote in the early decades of the 20th century. And this movement is often like a way of framing suffrage. We also typically describe the mid-20th century women's movement or women's liberation movement as the, quote, second wave, in which women extended their fight for the right to vote into other fights, into fights for equality in political life, in domestic life, and in social and in economic life. And so in the framing of the second wave, or in this kind of mid-20th century movement, we often think about how women argued for their right to enter workplaces, their right to work. They argued that that when they got there, they had the right to work without being taunted or harassed, and that they ought to be paid equally in those environments. They argued for control over their bodies and gave us phrases like no means no in their work to prevent sexual violence. And they fought for and they won the right to control and especially to withhold their reproductive capacities through access to contraception and abortion. It's because of women in this second wave that we have phrases like sexual harassment as part of our everyday vocabulary today. And then sometimes we talk about the third wave starting in the early 1990s as a time when feminists of color, lesbians and queer and trans feminists and non-US based feminists put pressure on existing US movements and said, hey, we're missing a lot of important things here. We're missing a complex analysis of race and racism, of queerness, of imperialism. We want to make choices that are free, and that might mean a whole bevy of things that are not on the sort of second wave agenda. We want something different. We want something more complex. This wave is often also characterized through the word empowerment. So women's empowerment or girl power are kind of like hallmarks of this idea of the third wave. Now, this wave model has been endlessly complicated by women's historians and by feminist theorists. And so I don't bring this up to belabor the point of the wave itself, because there are endless ways to kind of complicate that model. But the reason I bring this up is because it's a familiar part of situating the narrative through which we imagine the vote as the first big political fight that American women fought and the first big political fight that American women won. And so when we define suffragists as the first wave, I think that that's not just semantic. I think it's important because in doing so, we tend to explicitly establish them as the first, which situates the vote as the primary and foundational way that women entered into political life. And of course, that narrative and the way that it's kind of trafficked in colloquial spaces is, just as Professor Hernandez just mentioned, often a narrative that centers white women. But of course, it's not only a narrative about white women, and that's of course what we're here to talk about today. What troubles me and what I want to kind of think about in the next few minutes of my talk is that it's actually possible to maintain this framework, its basic plot points, its beginning and its end, its major wins and losses, but to do it with more diversity, right? It's possible to argue, as many wonderful historians have done, that Black suffragists were right there in the streets marching for the 19th Amendment, that Latina women were made up an enormous demographic of the Rosie the Riveter generation workforce, that the second wave and this mid-20th century feminist movement can't really be understood without the flourishing of third world women's feminisms. So, this set of additions to the narrative, not just at the end of the story, but all the way through, are super important and illuminate the continuous and effective change-making presence of women of color in the entirety of American feminist history. But I'm wary of this kind of add and stir method. The method of sort of add Black women and stir doesn't really alter the recipe. Maybe we've added some new elements, but at the end, we have a cake which has the same basic shape, size, and color. Importantly, this method maintains the primacy of the vote as a foundational, fundamental, and originary concern of American feminism. And it maintains the centrality of suffragists to the birth of American feminism. So doing, this narrative implicitly organizes feminist history around the push for political participation as the most recognizable form of resistance, as the thing that kind of counts as real political resistance. These aren't necessarily bad things, and of course, political participation has been a central and important part of American feminism. But the insidious underbelly of maintaining that narrative, of maintaining the vote and 1920 and the 19th Amendment as sort of the beginning of American feminism, is that when we talk about Black women in the vote, we frame adding Black women to the story as a kind of corrective. We end up saying a version of Black women were there too, while nonetheless reifying that that particular there is the appropriate place to attend to. So if the script is not Black women in the vote, but rather Black women's history of political resistance and resilience, then we can't possibly start in the early 20th century. And the vote becomes one aspect of, but not really the centerpiece of, the history of American feminism. If the story begins with Black women, then it begins not with the fight for the vote and for recognition of full citizenship rights, but rather with the fight for recognition of status as free human beings. So let me say that again. If we begin the story with Black women, the vote is not the main issue. The main issue is recognition of status as a free human being. Enslaved and formerly enslaved Black women mobilized for individual freedom and for the abolition of slavery from the moment that slavery began. Black women forged connections that helped them survive the passage across the Atlantic. They stole food for one another and they fed each other's children. They preserved religious and linguistic practices that kept them and their people whole. They invented new traditions that helped them make sense of the hellscape that they found themselves in. They posted pictures on the walls of their cabins and braided their daughters' hair. And they mastered the textile arts in an adamant act of refusal that they should not have beauty in their world. They were, Kimberly Welch argues, quote, prolific litigators who filed civil suits of all varieties and who sued for their freedom beginning in 1781, when Elizabeth Freeman became the first African-American of any gender to sue for her freedom. They also wrote toward freedom, beginning with Phyllis Wheatley, who at the end of the 18th century was the first American woman of any race to be depicted holding a pen. They also organized. They collaborated with Black men, and white women in the fight to end slavery, and they understood their plight as fully bound up together with the struggles for full citizenship across lines of race and gender. The writings and oratory of Harriet Jacobs, Maria Stewart, and Sojourner Truth were essential to cultivating the national political will that would eventually lead to the downfall of slavery through the Civil War. And those same women remained active after the Civil War, understanding that Reconstruction blew open a set of possibilities for a new world. After the war, Black women articulated their vision of full citizenship, not first in terms of the vote, but in terms of bodily autonomy, the right to a private life, the right to control their own reproductive capacities, and their ability to protect their families. Among the first things that Black women did after the war was to stand up in court, to testify, to name, to put on the record the sexual violence that white vigilantes made endemic to the post-war South. They also approached the Freedmen's Bureau and insisted on help to find the family members from whom they had been separated in slavery. And they insisted that the state recognize their families through marriage and through the right to raise their own children, the right to get to see their children grow up. And they organized for political participation and for the recognition of their full legal personality. The same women who collaborated with radical anti-slavery organizations were part of the dialogue that produced the Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, the 14th Amendment, which established birthright citizenship and the right to due process under the law, and the 15th Amendment, which made it illegal to infringe upon someone's capacity to vote based on their race or, quote, previous condition of servitude. So the precursor of the 19th Amendment and the fight for women's suffrage really took place during Reconstruction, with the passage of the 14th Amendment in 1868, because it was this fight, the fight for the 14th Amendment, and it's a fight in which famous white women suffragists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott also participated in. This fight was an opportunity to establish universal suffrage, regardless of race and regardless of gender. Here, the 14th Amendment is a historical moment that witnessed the first of many legal opportunities in which Black women's rights were sidelined, in which Black women's interests were sidelined. They were there alongside white women, alongside Black men, alongside white men, and they were fighting for a version of the 14th Amendment that would establish universal suffrage, so voting for everybody. Instead, what they got was a version of the 14th Amendment in which was meant to give meaning and substance to the end of slavery, to define what it would be like, what it would mean to be not enslaved. So if the 13th Amendment established that people were no longer to be enslaved, the 14th Amendment was meant to kind of give texture to that, to define what it would mean to be a citizen. The 14th Amendment outlined that anyone born on US soil, importantly accepting Indigenous Americans, which is another horror story of the 14th Amendment, that anyone born on US soil would be a citizen, and that citizenship would come with certain privileges. So that part encompasses Black women. But the 14th Amendment was also the first time that US law established suffrage as the province of men. So they established universal suffrage or birthright suffrage, but the 14th Amendment also established universal male suffrage. Here, in outlining what this new world of post-slavery citizenship would mean, and in attempting to incorporate Black people into the nation, lawmakers folded. Universal suffrage would be trimmed down to universal male suffrage, maintaining that all women, regardless of race, would be denied the right to vote, which then, of course, spurs on the necessity of the 19th Amendment. The history of the 14th Amendment is essential to understanding the fight for women's suffrage in the early 1900s because it failed on more than one respect. The first failure is that the 14th Amendment made the 19th Amendment necessary by excluding women from the right to vote. But the second one is really important when considering Black women's relationship to the vote. The second failure of the 14th Amendment is that it didn't enfranchise Black male voters for very long. The end of Reconstruction saw the rise of white vigilante terrorism, which also meant the fundamental and near total disenfranchisement of Black people across the board. So the story that comes next is not one in which Black women started fighting for suffrage after the 14th Amendment, after the move through and the end of Reconstruction, having already achieved the right to vote for Black men. Instead, the years between 1868 and 1920, when the 19th Amendment was passed, were marked by the worst period of state-sanctioned racial terrorism in the form of vigilante groups committing mass rape and lynching against Black people that the world had yet seen. This period was also the period in which Jim Crow justice muted Black people's capacity to defend themselves in court and sent them to labor camps where they were treated, David Oshinsky writes, with impunity that was, quote, worse than slavery. This was a time when segregated and substandard education, travel, and housing became the norm for Black people across the country. And of course, this extended long past 1920. So these foci, the capacity to live a life without violence, the capacity to be treated fairly in the courts, the capacity to access education, employment, healthcare, and housing were impossible to disentangle for Black women activists from the right to vote. So what does this do? When Black women are the starting point of the history of US feminism, as opposed to the vote as a sort of cornerstone of the history of US feminism, we learn a few things. The first is that the idea of formal political participation through voting and other means can only be understood as one piece of feminist politics. Through the history of Black women's actions, we have to understand performance, aesthetics, craft work, culture work, family building, and frankly, the simple act of survival as essential aspects of feminist activism. Second, Black women's relationship to the 19th Amendment was absolutely framed by the lack of Black enfranchisement in general in that period. And a celebration of the centennial of the 19th Amendment has to be situated in the crisis of ongoing Black disenfranchisement. So if 1920 was a period that saw the nadir of Black disenfranchisement, the lowest levels of Black capacity to actually actualize their ability to vote, then this moment that we're living in is a legacy of that. Universal women's voting has never been fully achieved because universal Black voting has never been fully achieved. And the third point that I want to make about this kind of rerouting of the narrative is that Black women's vision for a free world has been capacious. I want to end by reading just a few sentences from a wonderful new book by Martha Jones, who's a historian of Black women's intellectual history. Her book is called Vanguard: How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. And I think that she says it better than I really could. She writes, Black women did not attend the 1848 Women's Convention at Seneca Falls, but at the same moment in church conferences, they demanded rights equal to those of men. Black women did not join the new suffrage associations founded after the Civil War. Instead, they came in church women's societies to demand the vote and office holding in religious communities. Black women campaigned for the 19th Amendment, but they did not celebrate long once it was ratified. They understood it was only a slim guarantee and thus redoubled their efforts in a campaign that took them down a long road to the 1965 Voting Rights Act. She continues, Black women emerged from brutal encounters with enslavement, sexual violence, economic exploitation, and cultural denigration as visionaries, prepared to remedy their own circumstances, and by doing so, cure the world. So I want to leave it there with that wonderful phrase, cure the world. I think that Martha Jones's capacity to think about the untapped, under-recognized, and under-celebrated work of Black feminists before, during, and after 1920 is a really bold and ambitious and I think essential opportunity for us to center Black women in this moment of both celebration of the passage of the 19th Amendment and I think a moment of pause and mourning for the many ways in which the 19th Amendment, much like the 14th Amendment, has never been fully ratified in the political life of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Owens. And now we will hear from Professor Françoise Hamlin. Professor Françoise Hamlin is the Associate Professor of History and Africana Studies here at Brown. She earned her doctorate in African American Studies and American Studies at Yale University, her master's from the University of London, and her BA from the University of Essex, both in United States Studies. She is the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards for scholarship, mentoring, and teaching. Professor Hamlin is the author of Crossroads at Clarksdale, The Black Freedom Struggle in the Mississippi Delta After World War II, published with University of North Carolina Press. She is the winner of the 2012 Berkshire Conference of Women Historians Book Prize and the 2013 Lillian Smith Book Award for the book, These Truly Are the Brave, an anthology of African American writings on citizenship and war, which is a co-edited anthology published with the University of Florida Press in 2015. This book considers Black patriotism over 3 centuries tied to military participation, Professor Hamlin's new research focuses on youth, trauma, and activism. Welcome, Professor Françoise Hamlin.
Thank you, Professor Hernandez, and the Pembroke Center for this panel. And I hope that my comments today, I think, really does complement Professor Owens' comments. We didn't get to really see each other's talks beforehand, so but I like to think that this will be a really good layer for what she presented to us earlier. Okay, so for me, thinking about Black women's history in the 19th Amendment feels a little unnatural, as it probably did for Professor Owens. As I teach and read African-American history during the late 19th century and up into the present, and particularly through the World War II, something I've been doing for over 2 decades, the 19th Amendment registers actually quite slightly on the timeline of what African Americans and African Americanists consider the most important movements, milestones, moments, and crises. So why? And I want to kind of delve into that a little bit in the way that Professor Owens did. After slavery, the formerly enslaved received citizenship and became citizens. They, now African Americans, and I generally start using that term after these Reconstruction amendments that Professor Owens so beautifully explained, after they formally conferred citizenship to Black people. So at that point, African Americans began to assert their rights as citizens. What we know is that the institution of slavery didn't go lightly on women, and all Black people bore the whips, the chains, the nooses, the auction block, and the daily indignities of an inhumane treatment. Black women didn't enjoy any of the trappings of womanhood, nor did they get near a pedestal, of course, unless it was to build it or to clean it. We see the earlier suffrage movement post-Civil War that Professor Owens talked about as generally assembling white middle to upper class women and Black men, but of course we know Black women were there. And I'm not going to go into the generalizations. I'm talking in generalizations. Professor Owens elucidated that a lot more clearly, but we do know that these women didn't get the voice, the attention at the time. Black women, even though they didn't get the attention at the time, did so much of the groundwork. And here I'm reminded of the scholarship of Glenda Gilmore in Gender and Jim Crow, when she asserts that Black women channeled political activity through their communities as activists, mothers, teachers, upholders of the race, as wives, insisting on family and community politics and influencing their menfolk's electoral vote. To quote Gilmore, they took seriously their responsibilities as citizens. Black women organized to affect politics and were political, even though they were excluded from big P politics, electoral politics. Political acts of resistance in the everyday yielded results that were communal. And here I refer to one of my favorite teaching articles, which is Robin Kelly's We Are Not What We Seem, Rethinking Black Working Class Opposition in the Jim Crow South, where he talks about how Black folk enacted a political consciousness in the everyday when it was too dangerous to outwardly display any political tendencies. In 1992, Kelly forced us to think about alternative forms of politics, small p politics, and what we can learn when we look for these actions and spaces and discourses. And we talk a lot about intersectionality now since the 1990s, but that concept couldn't exist fully under Jim Crow. If you were Black, you were curtailed accordingly, regardless of age, gender, class, occupation, sexuality. While any of these identities could yield more oppression, and they did, Blackness dominated. Since the mass movement for civil rights and the disruption of de jure racial segregation, perhaps we have more of a luxury today to think intersectionally and live accordingly. But in short, Black women's politics, particularly at this time during the Jim Crow, revolved first around race because that was the defining feature. Therefore, African-American history's timeline will highlight World War I and the Red Summer of 1919, where white supremacists terrorized Black communities, particularly Black World War I veterans, often in uniform, across the country, killing hundreds. And then we can move on to, and we usually move on to the celebrated Black cultural production of the 20s, otherwise known as the Harlem Renaissance. And then we talk generally about sharecropping, migration, and civil rights, but not necessarily the passage of the 19th Amendment. And this doesn't mean, like I said, that Black women didn't engage in small p politics. They did all the time. Books like Glenda Gilmore's or Blair Kelly's book on bus boycotts around the country since 1896, and so many others document a lot of this engagement, including Martha Jones's brand new book and beautiful prize-winning book. But the feminist impulse that consumes discourse about the 19th Amendment doesn't include too many Black women. This continued into the mass movement for civil rights in the post-World War II decades. And I found this out in my own research on Black women in Mississippi, and I'll talk about one of the women I write about for the rest of my time. So I had met Vera Piggy as I pieced together the civil rights movement in Clarksdale, Mississippi for my dissertation and for later my book, and got to really understand how she conceptualized her work. Too often academics attach labels to folks who wouldn't necessarily identify accordingly. And, and I made the mistake of doing that. So as she told me of her work and her positionality, I made the mistake of calling her a feminist. And I got that look that older Black women have mastered for generations. And so I backpedaled really fast. And what I learned is that from her is that, in fact, she engaged in small p politics through the leadership framework of activist mothering. So Vera Piggy was highly visible in the early years from 53 into the mid-70s, and encompasses the range and depth of Black women's politics and local leadership during the civil rights movement in Mississippi. Women's activism on the local level was more continuous and less dramatic. It's often rendered non-political, right? Because their actions incorporated seemingly innocuous everyday activities. Piggy worked with local children, orchestrating the strongest and most active NAACP Youth Council in the state. And she always knew her own worth. She defined herself as a churchgoer, a professional woman, a mother, an activist. It is her in her self-definition that empowered her to maintain and thrive on what she called her struggle of struggles, which is the title she chose for her self-published autobiography. And I'm so blessed that I'm able to bring this autobiography back into publication soon. Experiences like hers must be analyzed in conjunction with the male leadership, not in competition, so that we're able to consider women's roles as mothers, wives, and daughters as part of their leadership and political techniques. As secretary and one of the founding members of the local NAACP branch, Piggy played a prominent role in the organization's activities in Clarksdale. And this level of politics was at the height of what locals were engaged in at the time. After the circus trial of Emmett Till's murderers in 1955, Vera Piggy was elected a state youth council advisor. At that point, Clarksdale was a hub for reporters covering the trial in nearby Sumner, and she helped the NAACP comb the Delta for witnesses. After assuming an elected role to organize the youth, she spent the better part of the next 4 years building the local youth council and the broader youth movement statewide, which under her direction asserted itself very early in the 1960s as one of the leading edges of the civil rights struggle in Mississippi, long before SNCC entered the state. And of course, the often taught narrative of the mass movement, particularly when Black history is crammed into 1 month or focuses on King or is squeezed into one lecture, is that SNCC came to Mississippi in 1961 and started the movement there. In fact, local people were already organized and active in the 50s and before. Women like Vera Piggy were at the forefront of that political activity. This concept of activist mothering, like Vera Piggy's work in the youth councils, comes closest to capturing this style of political engagement. Women like her expanded their niches within the hierarchical and male-dominated NAACP and other organizations, and developed strategies particular to their communities by continuing or expanding the work that they were already engaged in, especially the nurturing of the youth. Vera Piggy treated all in the youth council as her children. They held meetings at her beauty salon or at her house, and she opened up her home to them. And so it's important to note that she operated and owned a beauty parlor in the heart of the Black neighborhood in downtown Clarksdale. And seeing their own children put themselves on the line in the shadow of Emmett Till's murder in the next county, and in the face of massive resistance from the Citizens Councils, an organization born in the Delta, at the same time, these parents became active, overcoming their own fears. So Vera Piggy shows that Black women utilize their everyday social roles to promote political activism and radical change by example, and in conjunction with her other role as the NAACP branch secretary. While part of this clique, she corresponded and hosted most of the senior officers when they're in Mississippi and during the national conventions. She did not share the spotlight. She was a bridge leader between the community and the lectern, rather than a formal figurehead leader, to apply the work of sociologist Belinda Robnett, working on the ground with the community while holding positions in formal structures, but using local knowledge and contacts to be the most effective. By segmenting this model with the politics of mothering, activist mothers become more visible. She nurtured the local movement through a process of activist mothering, relying on traditionally female spaces such as the beauty parlor and responsibilities such as working with children and adolescents. She didn't benefit from the spotlights or the cameras, but her presence helped to drive the local movement and affect local politics. And her direction over the youth movement enabled her to reach huge numbers of local people. So I love these photographs because it captures Vera Piggy's political activism. On the left, you see her in her salon and she's working on her client's hair. And it seems innocent enough, yet on the client's lap are voter registration materials. And while she's doing her hair, Piggy is also giving a citizenship class, voter registration classes, walking her client through the process of getting registered to vote, hidden in plain sight. And there's so much to say here, and I give a full reading of this photograph in the book. There's a lot going on. The next photograph, in contrast, is her doing the work of teaching voter registration more formally, but it's also in the beauty salon after hours. And again, there's a lot to be said about this photograph and the work that's being done in these spaces, but I know I'm running late. For women like Vera Piggy, and I'm sure most communities had their own versions of her, they were mothers, daughters, and wives in a society that imposed heightened value on domesticity and women's traditional roles. And so it becomes clear that African Americans repositioned and transformed seemingly static stations into political weapons of resistance, empowerment, and maneuver. Because Black mothers are not affirmed by the status quo, rather they are cast as deficient, inferior, unworthy of dominant white privileges of motherhood, they could make changes and transform mothering to incorporate alternative elements. They are equipped with tools, almost by default, to resist social hegemonic norms. Using her political activist life as a template, it's easy to see then that the potential of African-American mothering as a site of resistance, politics, and empowerment. Her invisibility enabled her to work locally and utilize female-centered spaces like her own beauty salon to organize, but that same invisibility denied her any credit when her male colleagues got center stage. So think about the Vera Piggies in other communities, and you'll see how women's political activism, particularly Black women's political activism, is constant and constantly under the radar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hamlin. And now we will hear, last but not least, from Professor Juliet Hooker. Professor Hooker is the Professor of Political Science here at Brown, who specializes in racial justice, Latin American political thought, Black political thought, and Afro-descendant and indigenous politics in Latin America. She's known for combining both. She is the author of Race and the Politics of Solidarity, which asks, how can we create political solidarity when racial and cultural diversity are more or less permanent? Unlike the tendency to claim that the best way to deal with the problem of racism is to abandon the concept of race altogether, Professor Hooker argues that coming to terms with the lasting power of racial identity is the starting point for any political project attempting to achieve solidarity. In her recent award-winning book, Theorizing Race in the Americas, Douglas, Sarmiento, Du Bois, and Vasconcelos, Professor Hooker argues that Latin American and US ideas about race were not developed in isolation, but grew out of transnational intellectual exchanges across the Americas as 19th and 20th century United States and Latin American thinkers each looked to political modes or models in the other America to advance racial projects in their own countries. Professor Hooker's current research project examines the politics of loss. Please welcome Professor Hooker.
Thank you very much, Professor Hernandez, for that generous introduction, and thank you to the Pembroke Center for organizing this panel. It's an honor to be part of it, along with my esteemed colleagues, Professor Owens and Professor Hamlin. And as you'll see, there are a lot of connections between what they have to say, what they have had to say in their excellent remarks, and what I will add. And I want to begin this brief account of the contemporary activism political activism of Black women by citing a quote from the historian Brittany Cooper, who is a professor at Rutgers University. Quote, "Black women are important to the functioning of good government, but we are far more comfortable with Black women's political labor as workhorses for the system than we are with their thinking," end quote. I begin with this quote from Professor Cooper because I think it points to the fact that Black women have been doing the hard work of democracy in the United States, especially the work to create more just and life-affirming communities for us all, and to counter state violence and resist contemporary mobilizations of white grievance and racial and racist backlash. That work has been essential to preserving, as Professor Owens rightly said, we have not achieved fully functioning democracy in the United States because there's still racism and in particular racist voter suppression. But insofar as this work of democracy has been done, Black women have been doing an enormous amount of it. So thinking about how to characterize Black women's contemporary activism, there's too much to say in the brief amount of time I have here, but there are three important strands that I want to highlight. The first is this, to flesh out some more this idea that Black women have been doing the hard, often unseen labor of making democracy work. As signaled by calls to, quote, trust Black women and to, quote, follow the lead of Black women are some of the United States' most engaged and reliable voters. They're the background of the Democratic Party's base in particular, and its on-the-ground infrastructure, serving as poll workers and in get-out-the-vote operations, helping to register voters, as Professor Hamlin's beautiful example just illustrated. The 94% of Black women who voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016 were not a fluke. In many recent elections, Black women voters have turned out at higher rates than any other demographic. In 2008 and 2012, Black women had the highest turnout rate among all racial, ethnic, and gender groups in the United States. So there's just an enormous amount of civic participation that Black women engage in. No other major demographic is as loyal to either party as Black people. In concrete terms, this means that for every 10 new Black voters, 9 will likely vote for a Democrat and 1 for a Republican, yielding 8 net Democratic votes. And in contrast, 10 new Latino voters who voted 70% Democratic and 30% Republican in 2018 would produce 4 net Democratic votes. For white college-educated women, the figure is 2 votes. Put another way, 1 new Black voter has the same net effect as 2 new Latino voters or 4 new white college-educated female voters in terms of support for Democrats. And the reason that this matters is because to the extent that the Republican Party has become an anti-democracy party that tries to entrench its political fortunes by shrinking the electorate and entrenching minority rule, support for Democrats actually equals support for US democracy and for expanding the electorate and giving people more of a right to political participation. The extremely high engagement of Black women voters, this also has to be understood as taking place in the context of ever increasing and blatant voter suppression. We see this every election with the extremely long lines at often majority Black polling places, but it takes a lot of other forms, from felon disenfranchisement, which primarily impacts everyone, but impacts Black and Latino voters to a very large extent, and many other tactics that are used to suppress from, things like having only one polling station in very large urban areas. There are all these tactics that on their face are not intended to suppress Black votes per se, but that really have an enormous impact by design on suppressing and disenfranchising Black voters. And Black women have been at the forefront of efforts to counter these forms of voter disenfranchisement. They have created grassroots organizations to register new voters and motivate them to cast ballots. The work of groups like the New Georgia Project to transform the electoral landscape of the South has resulted in thousands of new voters. And in Alabama, Black women and the Black Voters Matter Fund played pivotal roles in the election of Doug Jones to the Senate in 2017. So another area that I want to highlight then is Black women's increasing assumption of important roles of political leadership as we in this moment and in previous eras. So Black female candidates, political strategies, and voters have participated in the building of the Democratic Party, for instance, particularly since the 1960s. The most visible example of this is the selection of Kamala Harris as a vice presidential nominee for the current ticket. But Harris's historic nomination stands on the shoulders of prior giants in the Democratic Party who broke down barriers, such as Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm, who was the first African-American woman elected to the United States Congress, who represented New York's 12th congressional district from 1969 to 1983, and who in 1972 became the first African-American candidate for a major party's nomination for President of the United States, and was the first woman to run for the Democratic Party's presidential nomination. As well as Barbara Jordan, the first African-American woman elected to the Texas Senate after Reconstruction, and the first Southern African-American woman elected to the United States House of Representatives. She was also the first African-American, as well as the first woman to deliver a keynote address at the 1976 Democratic National Convention. Today, we see Black women successfully running for office at all levels. Across the country, Black congresswomen like Lucy McBath of Georgia, Lauren Underwood of Illinois, and Ayanna Pressley of Massachusetts have run for office and won historic victories. Black women have also formed organizations to support and encourage more Black women to run for office and to maximize their political power. Glinda Carr's Higher Heights for America, She the People, founded by Amy Allison, and Power Rising, formed by Leo Daughtry, are examples of organizations that convene discussions with African-American women and empower those who are interested in running for office, and who also insist that political candidates answer questions that are important to this electorate. So during Democratic primaries, for example, almost all candidates showed up to discuss their views about race and gender at a forum that was held by She the People. Now, outside of voting and running for elected office, Black women are also doing some of this essential work of democracy in other ways. And one of these ways is as the founders and foot soldiers of some of the most visible and important social justice movements of our time, including the movement for Black Lives and the Me Too movement. The Movement for Black Lives is an umbrella organization that brings together long-standing and more recently formed organizations, including Black Lives Matter, which emerged in 2013 and was founded by three radical Black organizers, Alicia Garza, Patrice Cullors, and Opal Tometi, in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer, George Zimmerman. Likewise, the phrase Me Too was first used in 2006 by activist Tarana Burke, who began using Me Too to raise awareness of the pervasiveness of sexual abuse and assault in society. Over a decade later, in 2017, Me Too became a viral hashtag as women began using it to tweet about the Harvey Weinstein sexual abuse allegations and their own experiences with sexual harassment and sexual violence in their own lives. Me Too quickly developed into a broad movement and with international offshoots as well. So Black women's leadership in these struggles for racial and gender justice reflects the intersectional impact of racism and sexism on their lives, yet these are also struggles that impact the rights of all groups. Black women are keenly aware that all forms of oppression disproportionately affect them. Consequently, their movements have always been inclusive, even when that inclusion is not always been reciprocated, as Professor Owens noted in her discussion of the white women's suffrage movement. As the Combahee River Collective Statement eloquently observed in 1977, quote, "If Black women were free, it would mean that everyone else would have to be free, since our freedom would necessitate the destruction of all the systems of oppression," end quote. So Black women today, against all odds, continue to try to make a better world for themselves, their communities, and their fellow citizens. We need to honor and recognize their essential civic labor and their sacrifices on behalf of democracy. But we must also all take up the civic burdens that they have been carrying on the bridges called their backs. Black women alone will not save US democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hooker. It was a joy to hear all of you. And we're now going to take questions while we wait for the attendees to take in all the richness of each of these presentations. I wanted to give each of the panelists a moment, if they wanted to take it, to respond to one another. If there were things that you heard from your colleagues that you wanted to comment on, sometimes we get so caught up in answering questions from the audience, we don't get to talk to each other. So I thought, in this brief pause we have while the questions get typed in the Zoom culture, I'll give you a couple of seconds to talk to each other, or a few minutes. I can be generous.
I would jump in. I just want to amplify one of the things that felt to me so connected between Professor Hamlin and Professor Hooker's talks is Professor Hamlin, you used the phrase hidden in plain sight. And Professor Hooker, just at the end there, when you were talking about lightening the load that Black women have been carrying, I think that there's a real thread here, not just of like invisible stories, but of invisible work that has actually made lots of impacts that then are not recognized. And Professor Hooker, that gesture at the end feels extremely important to me, because sometimes I think when we invoke Black women's labor, there's this sense of like, it's mysterious and it's impossible to remedy or lighten. And with the specific, like the sort of specificity of saying like, let's think about civic labor. Let's think about what it means to work at the polls, to go to the polls and work at the polls. That's work that one could do. That's material. It's not mysterious. And so I just really appreciate the kind of demystification work that both of you did in your talks.
I think the three of us were, I mean, like I said before, the three of us kind of had a vague conversation about basic, temporal boundaries so that we weren't talking about the same things, but we all ended up talking about, it layers so well, all three of them are presentations, even though they're very different in so many ways. I hope that comes across anyway. That's what I picked up.
Well, I have questions for you if you're ready for them. Okay, this one is for all the panelists. In thinking about the mothers of the movement, speaking at the Democratic National Convention in 2016, mobilizing loss to state executions of Black sons, thinking about the murder of Breonna Taylor this year, and the increasing deployment of Say Her Name in, quote, mainstream discourses, how might Black women's political labors be centered in contemporary political work without extracting Black female labor as a corrective for structurally anti-Black and patriarchal institutions? That's a mouthful there. Let me know if you need me to repeat it, because there's a lot to take in from an auditory perspective. And any one of you could, because it wasn't targeted to any specific panelists, this one.
I think the question
So-
is basically how, oh, go on, Juliet, this is your field.
No. Go ahead. So I guess what I would start by saying is to pick up on something that Professor Owens said about how we talk about this labor of Black women, and I think that that's part of, as I was going through this, I was like, I don't want to end with let's just recognize the labor, because we just leave it as it is, right? We sort of say, oh, it's so great, and then there is no call for something else. And so I think that as we think about this question of how do we take on the insights, that the political insights and the democratic insights that Black women are formulating, one of the things to do that is to say, how can we be allies, and how can we recognize and work with people rather than supplanting them or simply taking the labor and taking the fruits of the labor without recognizing it. I think about, for example, right now, prison abolition has become something that a lot of people have found and embraced, but Black women activists have been doing this work for decades, literally, right? Of trying to bring these political ideas into the mainstream at times, if you think about 20 years from now, or even these earlier moments when these hard pivots to law and order were absolutely the way that people responded to any kind of protest, that when you think about, or to even any kind of social unrest, or to any sort of questions around crime in Black communities or any communities, that there is a way in which this work has been going on at a time when it was seen as very outside of the mainstream. It was not getting the kind of recognition that it gets now. And so now that these ideas are being brought in, I think it's important to recognize those activists who have been doing that work, to work with them, but to support them and not simply to supplant them. And that, for example, is one of the reasons why I gave the history of Me Too that I gave, right? Which is that there was this work that was being done before it reached this kind of mainstream audience. And so I think it's always important to make that move, and to think about how one can of course take up those insights, but in a way that doesn't supplant or somehow preempt the folks who have been doing that labor.
Thank you very much. There is another question that has come in through the channel. Would the panelists like to speak to skepticism, maybe especially among younger people, about whether voting matters, whether electoral politics makes a difference in people's lives? How would you respond to such skepticism?
I would just say, look around you. We're in a moment where 220,000 people are dead from a virus that could have been controlled. And we're in a situation now that will probably be online for a good 6 more months, if not longer. And that's where electoral politics comes in, right? Having a government in place that will do the work of making sure that there are enough supplies and healthcare is supported. It's more than just rhetoric. It's real, and I think these deaths in a country that is wealthy enough to avoid so much of it is inexcusable. So I think if nothing else, the last 4 years have really highlighted why the vote matters. When you look at, and Professor Hooker can speak to this more eloquently, but when you look at the figures of 2016 and who voted and why people didn't vote, I think the young folks need to get out there and vote. This is their future, right? This is more than just the next 4 years. It's what's going to be left at the end of it and how long lasting those effects will be.
Thank you.
I would also just add that there's real continuity between all three of our talks, in that I think all of us were in some ways decentering the vote or decentering political participation in formal ways in the history of Black women because it has not historically served Black women all that well to participate in formal political processes. But I think that though that amplifying other forms of political action, other forms of caring for community, other forms of survival and resilience and resistance is not at all antagonistic to or lacking compatibility with political participation. And I think that if all three of our talks centered other forms and tried to highlight other forms of Black women's political participation, there's a really very clear line of continuity here, which is that Black women have been pursuing the courts, Black women have been pursuing the vote, Black women have been using the vote, Black women have been helping other people vote. And so I think that it's in some ways a dishonor to that legacy to sort of assert that somehow continuing in those processes and enacting voting in this moment doesn't matter. I think that we dishonor the history of our foremothers if we don't vote.
So I think you've all said a lot of what I was going to say. I would just add that this is a discussion that activists are having themselves within these movements, right? Within the movement for Black lives, there is a lot of discussion about strategy and about what the right strategy is and about whether to engage electorally and about how that relates to being out in the street protesting. And I think that the analysis that they've arrived at is that you have to do both, right? And that you have to do it at multiple levels. So if you look at the ways in which things like defunding the police and investing in communities have become so important a part of the conversation, it's been Black Lives Matter chapters at the local level that have been pushing those reforms with city councils, and trying to get this on the agenda. So I guess what I would say is, just to reinforce the point, electoral politics is not the only form of politics, nor the most important part of it. It is one tool. And so, yes, there's an election in November. It's very important. But after the election, we still have to fight like hell. There's a lot of, it's not that is it. So, and I don't think any of these activists would have prioritized electoral politics over other forms of struggle.
Thank you. The next question is targeted towards Professor Hamlin directly. Regarding Vera Piggy's reluctance to be classified as feminist, could the speakers or Professor Hamlin talk about the dynamics in the Black female political community about feminist identification?
Well, I can talk about Vera Piggy particularly. She's a woman who was born in the 20s and lived in Mississippi, was and really took on her sort of role as wife and mother and beautician, professional businesswoman, which is unusual for the South anyway, and an activist. And for her, none of these things were in competition with each other. And for women of that generation, particularly in the South, this term feminism meant a white sensibility that was pro-female, pro-women, but didn't include the interests and concerns of Black women, which is historic, and we know about that. And so that's the tension outside of the academy, outside of those intellectual circles where young folks are actually having those conversations in the 50s and 60s, particularly in the late 60s, that turns into second wave feminism, and that turns into the Black feminist movement in the academy, but also on the streets as well. That produces these wonderful theories that we now work with and entangle with and help us do our work and understand better. But for the generation I'm talking about, with these women on the ground doing the work, they were pro-women, but they were also, so they didn't see the contradiction. And for them to have someone on the outside come in and label one way didn't work. it didn't work. And I got, like I said, I got the look, and, you know, and it really did force me to think about epistemology. How do folks understand the world they live in and define themselves? Because that shapes how they do their work. And if you're trying to understand that, you have to keep, you know, moving backwards to really think about how they define themselves. So that's sort of my not so quick answer to that.
Does anyone else want to chime in on this one? Okay, I've got plenty coming through, so let me get to the next one on the line. Where do you place Kamala Harris, both as a figure and the rhetoric around her, in the scope of the work and the arc of Black women's political history? I should say in the scope of your work and the arc of Black women's political history. Professor Hooker, would you like to take that one on?
Yes, I guess that one comes to me. You know, I think, as I said, that the way to understand Harris as a figure is to understand her in relation to these previous iconic, you know, Black female politicians, people like Chisholm, people like Barbara Jordan, who were trailblazers in their own right. And I think that in this sense, you know, Harris gets to be another first. I think that, you know, in terms of thinking about her, I also think that you know, Biden, you know, committed to choosing a female vice president, of course, because of the sort of gender dynamics around, you know, Hillary Clinton's loss and then him emerging as the nominee out of the most diverse field of presidential candidates that the Democrats had ever had, and that any party has ever had in this country. And I think also it was probably a response, really seen as a response to the racial justice protests that reemerged in the summer after the killing of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. But, you know, even if, right, activists in the movement for Black Lives have their own critique of Harris because she was a DA and the whole question of her, you know, whether, I think the thing that we have to think about in relation to her is that, you know, there's something like descriptive representation, right? The idea of having people who look, who are members of groups that haven't been traditionally represented. If we look at things like Congress and the presidency, it still has been overwhelmingly white and male. And if we look at, you know, I think we are at a point where we have to ask ourselves a question about why is it that so many more people feel like they can vote for Joe Biden than Hillary Clinton, and does sexism play a role in that? And so how we think about these, I think, you know, Harris for me is interesting insofar as she's a figure around whom we can ask these questions around the role of racism and sexism in who we see as capable of political leadership. And also because it raises these questions about what representation means, right? So is having somebody who, you know, who is Black, does that mean that she is going to necessarily represent the interests of, you know, the Black community? What's the Black community? There are multiple interests, right? It's not monolithic. And so I think that it's an occasion for us to have this conversation and to think about, you know, what exactly, more so than who is elected, thinking about how can one have push for the kinds of policies that you think are needed in this moment.
Thank you. Thank you. The next question is, as Professor Hooker said, a big part of keeping in place existing inequalities is the Republican Party's minoritarian politics. Efforts at GOTV are one way to mitigate keeping in power the mythical white working class. But how else do we fight this kind of minoritarian politics?
So I think that there are, I think one of the things that has become quite clear is that we need to push very much so to reverse the decades of voter suppression and disenfranchisement of particularly minority voters that have been baked into the political process, and really push for things like automatic voter registration, making voting more easier, more accessible. But beyond that, I think we need to look at these minoritarian institutions, things like the Electoral College, the way in which the size of the Supreme Court, all of these ways in which, what the US, I think, system is being exposed, right? The fundamental structure of US democracy is being exposed as being actually unable to respond to the desires of the majority of the electorate, right? So how do we make sense of that? I think what it says is, instead of fetishizing these institutions that we inherited from the past, that you remake the institutions to reflect the historical moment that you're in. But I think it will take things like thinking about DC statehood, thinking about, having a more expansive political imagination to say, how do we really create a democracy that can really represent, everyone in a more equitable way. And these are all proposals that various people are part of the national conversation.
Thank you. Thank you all for your scholarship and the richness of this conversation. Where do you see Black women expressing their activism, quote, hidden in plain sight today?
I actually wanted to just follow up on that last question, if that's okay. Although I think that the question about contemporary hiddenness is really important, but maybe actually they're tied. What I wanted to say about these structures that Professor Hooker was just naming, like the Electoral College, et cetera, and the ways that, and the structure of the Supreme Court, that these are kind of structures that can be manipulated and are being currently manipulated to exacerbate existing problems of disenfranchisement and voter suppression. And I think that there's a language that is really actually very heavily in the news right now around the newest Supreme Court nominee and her affiliation and fidelity to former Justice Scalia, the late Justice Scalia. This notion of kind of a fundamentalist interpretation of the law and of the Constitution. And I think that that is often expressed as a kind of neutral position among many. And I think that as a historian, it's impossible to disaggregate the Constitution from the moment in which it was created. And although there is a lot of really ideologically, I think, quite useful language that the founders offered through the Constitution and other sort of founding documents and discussions about the creation of American democracy, that language in its sort of literal interpretive meaning is not neutral, but in fact was the language of slaveholders who were attempting to maintain slavery and therefore implicitly Black non-citizenship. And so the kind of like continued expression of those things through things like the Electoral College requires, I think, some very active forgetting of that history in order to think about those institutions as just like always already present and always already positive aspects of American democracy. But in fact, they were birthed in a moment in which their existence was meant to uphold slaveholding American democracy. And so thinking about racism as not at all mutually exclusive with institutions that are part and parcel of American democracy. And therefore thinking about what it might mean to interrogate those institutions, not from a kind of neutral perspective of, well, we can interpret them as kind of fundamentally or literally as they are, or we can interpret them as relating to our moment. We can change them to sort of adjust to the political reality, to the cultural reality, and to the demographic reality of this country now. But I think to understand those things as neutral and to think about an interpretive world in which it's possible to engage with the Electoral College without encountering the history of slavery is a kind of fallacy that gets propagated as though it's neutral, in a way that then makes it seem like the activist mode of encountering the law or encountering political life or encountering, the work of the judiciary is somehow tinkering with this like beautiful and perfect initial form. And I think that anyone who does African American history, anyone who does American history with a level of seriousness about the kind of fundamental inequities that are built into the US Constitution understands that that approach is just not at all neutral. And so I think that engaging with these, that I just wanted to pick up on what Professor Hooker said about these structures. And I think that we can often encounter them as though they just are, but in fact, they were born in a moment and they can be changed in the moment now.
And I also just want to pop in is that, here is a woman saying this when if we were actually going with the original language, she wouldn't be in her position in the first place, because she wouldn't have the vote and she wouldn't be a judge. So yeah, I think that sort of forgetting and sort of I want to say irony, because that's the kind way of saying hypocrisy, but needs to be brought out and needs to be sort of challenged a lot more than I see it being challenged.
Does anyone else want to weigh in on the hidden in plain sight question, or should I move to the next? Okay, I'll go to the next then. How might abolitionist action center rich theorizations and practices by Black women to imagine new worlds and dismantle the hegemonic structures that signify voting as the supreme political tool?
I think Professor Hooker actually answered that earlier, sort of thinking about you have to do both. But I also want to kind of piggyback off something else she said earlier, which is, the sort of understanding that Black women have been doing this work for a very long time, but in their time, folks aren't believing them or listening to them, and that we would just avoid so much grief if folks just listened to Black women who are currently doing the work, right? Listen to them, because they're always right eventually, right? It always ends up being the right way of doing it. And as historians, we go back and like, look what they did. They were ahead of their time. Well, how about we just listen to the people who are here now? And sort of learning from that, and sort of learning from what are the Black Lives Matter, which is such a broad umbrella of organizations, and it looks so different at different local levels. But so, understanding what's going on the ground right now and listen to what's being said and take it seriously, I think would accelerate some of what's going, some of the activist movement that's happening on the grassroots level, which always ends up bubbling up.
Thank you. Thank you. The next question is, I'm working in a class to develop a report on supporting survivors of gender-based / patriarchal violence through non-carceral approaches. We have taken Representative Ayanna Pressley's words as our guiding theme. Quote, those closest to the pain should be closest to the power. I'm focusing on violence against Indigenous women, but I and the majority of my classmates, 4 out of 5, are white. How can we, as white grad students, center the experiences of Black women without also putting the responsibility on the, quote, bridge called their backs?
I can speak to that just to start. I think that it's a broad and really important question of allyship in a certain way, of how we can build solidarities. And I think that this bridge called my back is actually a really good example of a text that I think provides really good guidance. And that has been saved from being out of print. So you should go buy it now before it's out of print again. Anyway, I think that a lot of the writings in that text and in other texts written by women of color, thinking of, Audre Lorde wrote a really wonderful essay that often gets interpreted as kind of an antagonistic essay, but I think it's actually an outreach kind of let's build better solidarities and coalitions essay called A Letter to Mary Daly. And I think that in Bridge and in other collections of writings by women of color feminists, we see a roadmap actually to how solidarities and how solidarity can be enacted without doing harm or with doing more good than harm. and how coalitions can be built. And so I think that there are historical examples and just words that can guide us. I would also put on the radar, as one of these examples, there's a really beautiful book by Crystal Feimster called Southern Horrors, and she tells the story of these kind of like parallel activists, Ida B. Wells and Rebecca Felton, and the work that they did in the late 19th century to combat sexual violence. And there's a story there of work that was possible in coalition and then a missed opportunity, essentially. And I think that that book is so instructive for the ways that, for maybe creating a blueprint of what to avoid, of the ways that feminist politics across racial lines often diverge at the level of self-interest and at the level of expediency and at the level of one group of feminists, and in the case of this book of Rebecca Felton and white women in the late 19th century, saying, you know, it's politically expedient for us to leave Black women behind and to enact a racist politics. So I think that that's an important example. And then the other important thing here, I think, is to be really specific about distinguishing between the political and theoretical traditions of Black women and other women of color. So this question person, this student asker, you know, that you've said, you know, what are the kind of traditions that I can draw on for this particular work that I'm doing? And I would point you to the work of Sarah Deer, who's an indigenous feminist who's working on prevention and response to sexual violence in Indigenous communities. And so much like Professor Hamlin just said, it's about listening, right? It's about listening to the people who are most affected. And so I think that there is really good scholarship and really good activism to follow in the footsteps of and to take as a lead when it comes to Indigenous women protecting their own bodies. And I think that in some ways, Black feminism can be a resource for that work, but in other ways it can't, that Black feminism is not actually endlessly capacious for answering every question, and that Indigenous women know best, I think, how to protect their own bodies and communities.
Now, given that we have only 4 minutes remaining, my thought is to at least list out all the questions, and you can pick out, you know, one or half, whatever you would like to respond to, or if you just have closing comments, because sometimes it's just useful that everyone hear the rest of the questions as a manner of having sort of a more thought-provoking conversations thereafter. So I'll just run through the list, and then you can each respond as you like. This is from an audience member in Brazil. I'd like to share with you that here in Brazil, we have some Black trans women running for office and winning, including Erica Malguinho, the first Black trans woman to be elected for deputy in Sao Paulo. Is America ready to, or I should say North America, ready to have a Black trans woman running for Congress? The vote, by nature, seems to be a political intervention within a given nation state. To what extent have these processes of democracy building by Black women occurred in cooperation with Black women or other populations internationally? I would love to hear your thoughts on Michelle Obama's effect on Black women and voting. Thinking about intersectionality, should the 19th Amendment, should it have been an amendment to the 14th Amendment? And the final is someone said who they'd like to hear more about the connection of this discussion with the other America, Las Americas, so the cross comparison studies that Professor Hooker engages in. So I will leave you to each of you wrap up in 1 minute. Whatever parting thoughts you might want to leave the audience with.
So I'll take my minute to talk about the wonderful work that's actually being done on Black women's activism in Brazil. Some of that is done by our colleague Keisha Khan-Perry, who's an Africana, who does fantastic work on Black women's fight for space and land and in urban areas and their you know the political labor that they're doing. But I also think there's a lot of fascinating work that's being done on Black women's movements and the ways in which, you know, they have also been turning to the political arena, as you rightly point out, to getting Black women elected in office. And of course, there's the very tragic story of Marielle Franco, who was assassinated, who was one of these women who comes out of the Black women's movement and is playing a role, and who is then killed for that activism. So I think there are absolutely these connections across the hemisphere where we see kind of similar patterns of Black women doing this kind of often invisible work of democracy, and then trying really to have a say on their terms in national political debate. So a colleague of mine, Luciani Rocha, for example, talks about how after the current far-right government emerged after the Dilma Rousseff's impeachment in Brazil, that the Black women's movement is left without a state interlocutor to carry out their political projects, but they continue, of course, to do that work because they have to survive.
Thank you. Professor Hamlin?
I guess thinking about the possibility of trans women getting elected in the US, it's like everything else, right? It's like, you know, let's work on getting Black women elected. Let's work on getting Latino, you know, let's work on getting non-white males elected. It's part of that. I don't think, you know, I don't want to start hierarchy, you know, putting hierarchies on who should be elected over others, because the politics. Is this country ready? Not if we, we'll know in a few weeks if this country is ready. And I really, you know, and I say that glibly, but I think it's true. I think, you know, sort of where there's a lot of educating to do. There's a lot of educating that's being done but not heard. So we'll see, you know. I think just thinking about how Kamala Harris has been received and the venom that's been directed towards her, which of course she was prepared for and ready for. This is a woman who's probably had to deal with this all her life, particularly all her public life. You know, if this country can't tolerate a Black woman as VP, how does that bode for other folks who are struggling to be represented as well? So, you know, we'll see. Everyone go out and vote.
Thank you. And we'll circle right back to where we began with Professor Owens.
Thank you. I'm hesitant to have the last word, but here I am. I think I wanted to address the question about the 19th Amendment and as a revision of the 14th Amendment. I think that's interesting as a provocation. And I also think that it's a call, I think, to notice the ways that different genealogies of different political groups, of people who have different legal personalities, and I mean people who naturalize into citizenship in the United States. I mean various levels of documented and undocumented immigrant groups. I mean people who have access to housing, have the capacity to make material their maybe legal status as a voter, but maybe can't do that because they have other kinds of material things that are hindering their capacity to actualize that. I mean, people who have experienced incarceration and have been essentially criminalized out of the vote. There's all of these categories of people. And I think that to think the 19th Amendment with respect to the 14th Amendment is, I think, an invitation to think about a kind of constellation of legal protections and legal inhibitions to actualizing the vote. In a universal way, to making universal suffrage possible. And so I think, you know, if thinking about Black women's history means that we can't think about the 19th Amendment without the 14th Amendment, we also can't think about it without the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which means that we can't then think about it without Shelby v. Holder in 2013, which completely gutted the Voting Rights Act and made Black disenfranchisement legal again. So, you know, I think that those are like really big monumental decisions, but I think we have to think about and engage with legislation and with law in the courts as very much alive and as something that's evolving and that we have the capacity to engage with, and that impacts our lives and that changes over the course of many times within a single generation. And so I think, I like the idea of putting those two big amendments in conversation with one another, because it's an invitation to think about this kind of constellation or network of laws that can protect or inhibit our capacity to actualize democracy.
Thank you, Professor Owens. And I'm sure the audience, if they were all here with me in person, would be standing up and saying thank you to all, Professor Hooker, Professor Hamlin, and Professor Owens, for a very rich and engaging conversation. Thank you all for attending. Encourage people who weren't able to attend to watch the video because of the richness of the conversation. Thank you very much.